The woods had always been quiet, too quiet. Nestled on the outskirts of Black Hollow, the dense forest was a place few dared to wander after nightfall. The trees stood tall and ancient, their gnarled roots twisting through the damp earth like skeletal fingers reaching for the surface. It was a place of whispered legends, of stories told in hushed voices around flickering campfires. But none had ever been quite like this. It began with a horse. A stallion, black as the midnight sky, stood frozen at the heart of the forest. Motionless, its breath misting in the crisp autumn air, its eyes locked onto the ground beneath its hooves. No amount of coaxing could move it. The farmers who found the animal had never seen anything like it. Jacob Tanner was the first to try. A seasoned rancher, he approached the beast with a quiet confidence, gripping its reins and giving them a gentle tug. "Come on, boy," he muttered. "Let's get you home." The horse didn't budge. A flicker of unease passed through Jacob as he studied the animal's posture. Its ears twitched, its nostrils flared, but it remained still, almost as if it were guarding something. The others gathered around, their murmurs drifting through the trees. Someone suggested the horse had been injured. Another swore the ground beneath it looked wrong, uneven, disturbed. "Maybe something's buried there," a voice whispered. Jacob felt a chill crawl up his spine. He knelt, brushing aside a layer of damp leaves. The earth was loose, softer than the rest. He hesitated for only a second before plunging his hands into the soil. What he pulled up made his stomach twist into knots. A bone. Long, brittle, unmistakably human. The whispers around him turned to gasps. Some stepped back, their eyes wide with shock. The black stallion let out a shuddering breath, but still did not move. And then, from somewhere deep in the forest, came a sound, a low, distant moan. The air thickened, the shadows stretched. The trees seemed to lean in closer, as if watching. Jacob swallowed hard. Whatever lay beneath this ground, it was never meant to be uncovered. Jacob Tanner had always been a man of the land. He was the kind of person who found solace in open fields, in the rhythmic clatter of hooves against dirt, in the smell of freshly turned earth. His hands were calloused from years of hard work, his shoulders broad from the burdens he carried, both the physical ones and the kind that lived deep in his mind, the kind that surfaced in the dead of night when sleep refused to come. At 43, Jacob had seen his fair share of life's cruelties. He had lost his wife, Ellen, a decade ago to pneumonia, a sickness that had crept in like a shadow and stolen her breath before he could do anything to stop it. Her absence had left a gaping hole in him, one he had tried to fill with work, with long days spent tending to the horses on his ranch, with whiskey on the loneliest nights. But grief had a way of lingering, settling into the bones like an old wound that never quite healed. He was a quiet man, but not unkind. People in Black Hollow respected him, though they didn't always understand him. There was something about Jacob that made others keep their distance, not out of fear, but out of a quiet reverence. Perhaps it was his eyes, a piercing gray that seemed to carry the weight of things unsaid. Or maybe it was the way he spoke, measured and deliberate, as if every word carried a history behind it. But there was something else, something only a handful of people knew. When Jacob was 10 years old, he had gone missing in these very woods. It had been late autumn, just before the first frost, and he had been playing near the edge of the forest, chasing after his father's old hound, Buster. The dog had darted between the trees, tail wagging, ears perked at something unseen. Jacob had followed, his boots crunching over fallen leaves, his breath coming in excited puffs. And then nothing. The next thing he remembered was waking up at the base of an ancient oak, the bark rough against his back, the sky a deep, bruised purple overhead. He had been gone for 3 days. 3 whole days. They found him weak and shivering, his clothes damp with morning dew. But what disturbed his parents most wasn't the fact that he had been lost. It was the fact that he couldn't remember anything. Not where he had been, not how he had survived without food or water, not why there were strange scratches running down his arms, as if something had tried to hold him in place. For years, the townsfolk whispered about it. Some said he had simply wandered too far and gotten turned around. Others swore he had been taken by what they wouldn't say. Jacob had tried to put it behind him, but the nightmares never stopped. Even now, decades later, he sometimes woke in a cold sweat, his heart hammering, his breath shallow. In those moments, flashes of something would come to him. A whisper in the dark, a shadow moving between the trees, the sensation of fingers curling around his wrist. And always, the overwhelming sense that something had been watching him, waiting. But life had a way of moving forward, even when the past clung tight. Jacob had thrown himself into his work, building up the ranch, taking in stray horses, making a name for himself as a man who knew the land better than most. The memories dulled with time, pushed to the back of his mind, locked away, until today, until the black horse refused to move, until his hands had dug into the soft earth and pulled up that brittle human bone, and suddenly, all the old fears came rushing back. Jacob had spent his entire life trying to forget what happened in these woods. But maybe the woods hadn't forgotten him. Black Hollow had always been different. The town itself was small, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, where gossip spread faster than the autumn wind. But beyond the rolling farmlands and winding dirt roads lay the forest, an ancient, sprawling woodland that seemed to exist in its own world, untouched by time. The locals had a name for it. The Hollow. It was a place of quiet dread, a place people spoke of in hushed tones. The trees there were older than the town itself, gnarled and towering, their roots twisting through the earth like veins in rotting flesh. The canopy was so thick in some places that even at midday, little sunlight reached the forest floor. Instead, shadows pooled beneath the branches, shifting and stretching like living things. The air in the hollow was different, thicker, almost tangible, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and sharp. Some said it was the smell of decaying leaves, but others swore it was something worse, something unnatural. The deeper one ventured, the stronger it became. At night, the forest came alive with sounds that didn't belong. The usual chorus of crickets and rustling leaves was interrupted by things that sent shivers down the spine. Low whispers that carried on the wind, the snap of twigs underfoot when no one was there, the distant sound of something breathing. People who entered the hollow spoke of strange happenings. Objects going missing, time slipping away, the feeling of being watched. Hunters would sometimes return pale-faced and shaken, swearing they had seen figures moving between the trees, glimpses of something just out of reach. Some even claimed the trees themselves shifted when no one was looking, closing paths and leading them in circles. But the most chilling legend of all was the story of the buried ones. Long before Black Hollow was settled, before roads were paved and houses were built, the forest belonged to something else. The land carried an old curse, or so the elders claimed. The indigenous tribes who once lived nearby refused to set foot in the hollow, calling it the place where the ground hungers. They told stories of travelers disappearing, of voices luring the lost into the dark, of the earth itself swallowing those who ventured too far. But the real horror came centuries later, during the town's founding. Records spoke of a settlement that once existed at the heart of the hollow, one that had been wiped from history. In 1783, a small group of colonists sought refuge in the forest, building homes, carving a new life for themselves. But something went wrong. The townsfolk had been thriving, or so the journals claimed. And then, one by one, they began to vanish. First, it was a hunter, his footprints leading into the trees but never back out. Then a woman, taken from her bed in the dead of night, her sheets found soaked in blood. A child disappeared next, her toys left scattered at the forest's edge. Panic spread. Families fled. And then silence. By the time a search party arrived, the village was abandoned. The homes stood empty, their doors left open as if their occupants had walked out in a hurry. Meals sat rotting on wooden tables. A single lantern still burned in the town square. But there were no bodies, no signs of struggle. Just one thing remained, a mass grave at the center of the village, the earth freshly disturbed, a pile of bones resting just beneath the surface. The town was erased from maps, its name forgotten, its existence denied. The few who knew of it called it the Lost Settlement. They warned their children never to stray too far into the woods, never to dig where the ground seemed too soft, never to listen to the whispers. Because whatever had taken those people, whatever had buried them beneath the hollow, was still there. And it was still hungry. The forest had a way of making itself known. Those who tried to ignore its presence always found themselves drawn back to it. Animals refused to go near certain areas. Birds wouldn't sing in its deepest parts. Even the wind seemed different there, carrying voices from a past long forgotten. Jacob Tanner knew this better than most. Standing at the edge of the hollow, he could feel it, the way the air seemed heavier, how the silence felt wrong. The trees swayed gently, their branches scraping against one another like brittle bones. The scent of damp moss and old wood filled his nostrils, but beneath it, something lingered, something bitter and unsettling. The black stallion still hadn't moved. Its nostrils flared, breath coming in shallow bursts, ears twitching at sounds only it could hear. Jacob swallowed hard, his eyes locked on the disturbed earth beneath the horse's hooves. The soil here was darker, wetter, as if it had been recently turned. And suddenly he felt it, the same feeling he had as a child, that same heavy weight pressing against his chest, that same eerie silence stretching just a little too long, that same sense of being watched. Somewhere deep in the hollow, a branch snapped. Jacob turned, his pulse quickening. There was nothing there, just the trees, just the endless, looming trees. But he knew better. The hollow was awake, and it had been waiting for him. Jacob Tanner's breath came slow and steady, but his fingers trembled slightly as they rested on the horse's reins. He didn't want to admit it to himself or to the others standing behind him, but he was afraid. The hollow had never felt right, not since he was a boy, and standing here now, with the unearthed bone in his hands and the black stallion frozen in place, that feeling had returned stronger than ever. The others weren't blind to it either. Jacob, a voice broke through the quiet. It was Tom Whitaker, the town's veterinarian. His usually steady voice had an edge of unease. Maybe we ought to cover that back up. Jacob turned the bone over in his hands. It was old, brittle, but unmistakably human. There were markings on it, small, deliberate notches running along the length of it. They weren't natural. Someone had carved them there. He exhaled sharply, forcing himself to focus. "We need to see how deep this goes," Jacob said, his voice more confident than he felt. No one moved. It was Sheriff Allen who finally broke the standoff. With a tired sigh, he knelt beside Jacob, digging his fingers into the damp earth. "You and I both know this won't sit right if we walk away," the sheriff muttered. Jacob nodded. Together, they dug. The hole widened. More bones surfaced, ribs, a broken femur, pieces of a skull. A whole skeleton was down there, and as they worked, the feeling of wrongness grew. The air thickened, heavy with something they couldn't name. The stallion let out a nervous snort and stepped back for the first time since they'd arrived. Then Jacob's hand brushed against something else. Not bone. Wood. He hesitated before pulling it free. It was a wooden plank, splintered with age. The back was worn smooth, but the front, someone had scratched something into it. A word. Beneath. Jacob's breath caught. Sheriff Allen cursed under his breath. "That's enough. We need to call in state authorities for this." But Jacob barely heard him. Something was wrong. The trees had gone silent. No wind. No rustling leaves. No insects. Nothing. Then came the whisper. Low. Impossible to place. Right at the edge of hearing. Jacob stiffened, his eyes scanning the tree-line. He could feel it now. The weight of something watching him, something just beyond his sight. Then, the stallion let out a shrill, ear-piercing scream. The sound shattered the silence, sending birds scattering from the trees. The horse reared, kicking wildly, yanking the reins free from Jacob's grasp. It bolted, disappearing into the forest as if fleeing from something unseen. Jacob's heart pounded. Then came the second sound, a deep, resonant knock from beneath the earth. Jacob jerked back from the hole. What the hell was that? The sheriff's face had gone pale. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was rhythmic, purposeful. Jacob swallowed hard. The hole wasn't deep enough for a coffin, And yet, the knocking came from below, from under the bones, beneath. He turned back to the wooden plank in his hands. The carved letters seemed darker now, as if the wood itself had absorbed some of the forest's dread. Then another sound. This time it came from the trees. A snap, a rustle, the crunch of something moving over fallen leaves. Jacob turned sharply. The others did too. A shadow flickered between the trees. Too tall, too thin, standing just beyond the clearing. Watching, the sheriff stood first. Time to go. His voice was tight, controlled, but Jacob could see the tension in his stance, the way his hand hovered near his revolver. Jacob didn't argue. He didn't want to be here anymore either. He stood, brushing dirt from his jeans, glancing back one last time at the hole. The bones, the wooden plank, the word beneath. Something in his gut told him this wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Jacob Tanner had always been a practical man. He didn't scare easy. But tonight, as he stood at the edge of that open grave, as the rhythmic knocking from beneath the earth grew louder, something inside him cracked. His pulse thundered in his ears. Knock, knock, knock. Whatever was making that sound, it was trying to get out. Sheriff Allen took a step back, his hand now gripping his revolver. We should leave. Right now. But Jacob couldn't move. His eyes were locked on the pit, on the bones strewn across the disturbed earth, on the plank still clenched in his fingers. Beneath. Then the dirt began to shift. It started as a tremor, a subtle shudder in the soil. Then a bulging, like something pressing upward from below, pushing against the earth as if clawing toward the surface. Jacob took a shaky step backward. This isn't right. The others were frozen, their breath coming in sharp gasps. Then, the ground split open. A mass of rotted wood and soil erupted from the pit. The smell hit them first, a choking stench of decay, thick and cloying, as if something had been left to fester beneath the hollow for too long. Then came the hand. It shot up from the dirt, fleshless, fingers twisted at impossible angles. But it wasn't just bone. Something black clung to it, something thick and pulsing like tar that slithered over the knuckles and wrists like living tendrils. A groan rose from beneath the earth, a sound that didn't belong to the world of the living. Jacob stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat. This isn't happening. This isn't real. Sheriff Allen reacted first, raising his gun. Jacob moved, but Jacob was paralyzed. The hand flexed. The dirt buckled, and then it pulled itself up. From the grave, from the hollow's rotting underbelly, something rose. It had once been human, maybe, but now it was something else. A figure, impossibly thin, its flesh half-rotted and dripping with the same black sludge, as if it had been buried not just in dirt, but in something worse, something alive. Its eye sockets were hollow, gaping voids of shadow, but Jacob swore he felt them lock onto him. And when it opened its mouth, the whisper returned. Not words, not a language, just a sound, a wet, rasping hiss that slithered into Jacob's ears, into his skull, into his bones. And then, the stallion screamed from the woods. Jacob snapped out of his trance, gasping as if coming up for air. Run, he shouted. The sheriff fired his gun. The crack of the shot split the night, but it didn't matter. The bullet never reached the thing. It stopped in midair, trembling, before crumpling into dust. Sheriff Allen paled. Jacob turned and ran. The others didn't need to be told twice. They bolted through the trees, the forest closing in around them. Jacob could hear it, the sound of something following. The wet squelch of footsteps in the mud. The trees groaning, as if something heavy pressed against them. And worst of all, the whispering never stopped. It grew louder, closer. Inside his head, Jacob's vision blurred. The trees weren't right. They twisted and stretched, their bark rippling, faces emerging in the knots, watching, grinning, whispering with mouths that shouldn't be there. His legs burned. He kept running. The others' footsteps pounded behind him. Sheriff Allen, Tom Whitaker, a few others. But something was missing. Someone was missing. Jacob turned his head and saw the shadow consume one of them. Mitch Carter, the youngest of the group, barely 30, had fallen behind. He was still running, his eyes wide with terror, until the thing caught him. Jacob watched as the darkness took him. It wasn't an attack. It wasn't fast. It was slow, deliberate. The shadows peeled from the trees, like liquid tendrils, wrapping around his legs, his arms. He tried to scream, but the sound never came. Then, he was gone, swallowed whole. Nothing left. Jacob's stomach lurched. He ran faster. The hollow did not let go of its own. They burst from the trees. The open fields of Black Hollow spread before them, bathed in pale moonlight. And suddenly, the whispering stopped. Jacob staggered to a halt, sucking in breath after breath. He turned. The hollow stood behind them, its tree-line looming, stretching endlessly into the dark. But the thing that had chased them, it did not cross the boundary. Jacob's pulse hammered. The others stood frozen, eyes locked on the forest, waiting to see if it would follow. But the woods had gone silent again. The hollow had taken its offering. And for now, it was satisfied. Jacob swallowed hard. His hands were still trembling. Then he looked down. The wooden plank was still clutched in his fingers. Beneath, a warning, or a command. He didn't know. But one thing was certain. The hollow had not forgotten him. And one day, it would call him back. Jacob Tanner stood at the edge of Black Hollow, his breath still ragged, his body trembling with exhaustion. The others were silent beside him, staring back into the darkness of the forest. No one spoke. No one dared to move closer. The thing that had risen from the grave, the thing that had taken Mitch, was gone. Or at least, it had retreated. But Jacob knew the truth. The hollow didn't lose things. It collected them. And tonight it had collected one more soul. Sheriff Allen was the first to break the silence. He exhaled a shaky breath, holstering his gun with hands that were still shaking. "We don't speak of this," he said, his voice hoarse. Not to anyone. Jacob didn't argue. What could they say? Who would believe them? That the earth had cracked open, that something impossible had crawled out, that the trees whispered and the shadows swallowed a man whole? No, no one would believe them. And even if they did, it wouldn't matter, because Jacob had felt it. That thing in the grave, it wasn't just buried. It had been locked away. Some group of people long ago, had tried to keep it down there. They had marked the bones, scratched messages into wood. Maybe it had worked for a while. Maybe the hollow had been asleep. But tonight, they had woken it up. Jacob's fingers clenched around the wooden plank, his eyes drifting down to the word carved into its surface. Beneath. A warning? A command? He still didn't know. And that terrified him. Black Hollow had returned to normal. At least on the surface. People still went about their lives, still worked their fields, still gossiped in the general store. Mitch Carter's disappearance had been written off as a tragic accident. Maybe he had gotten lost. Maybe he had fallen into a sinkhole. Maybe he had run away. The town had convinced itself of that last theory, because it was easier to believe a man ran away than to admit the hollow took him. Jacob didn't argue. He let them believe what they wanted. But deep down, he knew the truth. He could feel it. The hollow had changed. The trees seemed taller. The wind whispered differently. And at night, the whispers weren't just in the woods anymore. They were closer. Outside his window. In his barn. In the walls of his home. It happened just past midnight. Jacob was sitting at his kitchen table, the old wooden plank resting in front of him. He had stared at it every night since the incident, running his fingers over the letters. Beneath. What did it mean? And why had it been left for him to find? His whiskey glass was still half full when the sound reached him. Knock. Jacob froze. The sound came from beneath the floorboards. Knock. 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 Slow. Rhythmic. Just like before. His stomach twisted. He pushed back from the table, his chair scraping against the floor. Silence. Jacob's breath came in slow, uneven gasps. Maybe it was his imagination. Maybe he had finally lost it. Then, the whispering began. Right behind him, Jacob spun around. Nothing. Just his empty kitchen, the dim glow of the lantern flickering against the walls. But the whispering, it hadn't stopped. It was inside his head now. Like fingers trailing against the back of his skull, like voices pressing just beyond his ear, calling to him. And then, the floorboards split open. A jagged crack ripped across the wooden planks, and Jacob staggered backward, choking on air. Something moved beneath the floor. Not a rat, not a person, something deeper, something darker. Jacob's vision swam. The walls of his house weren't right. The wood bled black tar. The ceiling sagged as if the entire structure was breathing. And then, the whispering stopped. For just a second. Then came the final sound. A single, deafening knock. From inside the house. Right behind him, Jacob's breath hitched. He turned slowly, and the last thing he saw was the thing standing in his doorway. Tall. Wrong. A body that was never meant to walk among the living. It smiled, and in the lantern's flickering light, Jacob finally understood. The hollow never took people at random. It chose. It waited. It whispered. And now, it had chosen him. The last thing he heard was his own scream, before the hollow claimed him too. The new owners of Jacob Tanner's house didn't know what had happened to him. They only knew he had disappeared, just like Mitch Carter. Just like the people from the Lost Settlement all those years ago. Just like all the others. The house sat empty for a long time before the Johnson family moved in. They were a nice family. They didn't believe in ghosts or legends or whispers in the dark. But then, one night, their little girl woke up crying. When her mother rushed to her room, the girl was sitting up in bed, staring at the floorboards with wide, terrified eyes. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" her mother asked, smoothing the girl's hair. The child swallowed hard. Then, in a small, trembling voice, she whispered, "There's a man under the floor. He keeps knocking. The hollow never lets go."